This episode was brought to you by Audible.com. These episodes take a lot of research. One of the many books I used as a resource for this one was Into the Black, The Inside Story of Metallica, which is a great book you can find on Audible. And if you, like me, have found that your attention span has just been completely obliterated during the pandemic and haven't had the ability to read full books, I've found that audiobooks have really helped me keep my focus and actually finish things. If you'd like to try it out for yourself, visit audible.com/toddintheshadows or text Todd in the Shadows to 500-500. Again, that's audible.com/toddintheshadows or text Todd in the Shadows to 500-500. Thank you, and now on with the show. What you are watching is, of course, the final scene of Some Kind of Monster, the legendary, mystique-destroying documentary detailing the making of Metallica's 8th album, Saint Anger.
What have you been doing? Picking at me all night.
Even in the long, proud history of unflattering rockumentaries, there may be no film that has been more revealing or more embarrassing to a band. Metallica were gods among men, the biggest and best heavy metal band in history. And this movie instantly turned their perception from hardcore legends to spoiled, dysfunctional, rich assholes.
Those things we throw out to each other are complete bullshit.
I think it's fucking stock. Which part of that is unclear to you? I think it sounds stock to my ears.
We see them whine, bicker, argue, and then hire a therapist so they can whine, bicker, and argue in touchy-feely language.
You use the word control and manipulation a lot. I realize now that I barely knew you before. Fuck!
But it ends on a triumphant note. Despite all the chaos, we're told, it all comes together at the end with Metallica restored whole, productive, and once again dominating the charts.
Hey, I love you. I love you too.
Go! It is, to put it mildly, a diplomatic epilogue that leaves out one crucial detail. The album was unreal levels of bad.
Saying it's like the worst production job I've ever heard on any album.
If you are even a little bit of a music person, it should not be news to you that Saint Anger is not a well-liked album. In fact, I feel real trepidation coming into this because Saint Anger is not just a bad album, it may be the biggest bad album of all time. Not necessarily the worst, but the most infamous. Like, what else would it be? Bob Dylan's Self-Portrait, Lou Reed's Metal Machine music, the greatest hits of Chris Gaines? Those weren't number one in 30 countries. If you just stop people on the street and ask them to name a bad album. We surveyed 100 people, top 5 answers on the board, name a bad album.
Saint Anger.
Good answer, good answer. There's tons of bad music out there, but none with this level of attention. It's the only bad album in history that was so big that there was a documentary about the making of the album and a book about the making of the documentary. I was there. I remember the pre-release. That album was hyped up to the moon. Saint Anger going number one isn't a triumph, it's a disaster. Metallica was so big that everyone bought and listened to that record on name recognition alone, just to find out that they'd bought a grating, dissonant, unlistenable bag of emotional vomit. Saint Anger round my neck. One person who did not listen to Saint Anger is me. I was driven away by the toxic buzz and I just never returned. And I assume there were a lot of people like me, because Metallica was, at that point, bigger than metal, bigger than rock even. They were music for the masses, for people who probably didn't even listen to any other heavy metal, who had no Pantera or Megadeth records. They were brought on by shit like Until It Sleeps and Nothing Else Matters, not the earlier, harder stuff like the full 8 minutes of Harvester of Sorrow. So let me stand in for them today, the normie, basic bitch Metallica fan, and join me on my journey. An angry, badly mixed journey through the Church of Saint Anger. We're off to Angerland! This is TRAINWRECKORDS.
Give it up for Metallica!
This is Metallica closing out the 2003 MTV VMAs. For some reason, they open up their set by covering Lenny fucking Kravitz. In fact, they blow through a whole bunch of other famous riffs from different artists. Odd choice, but it does make sense. They needed to start with this medley of crowd pleasers, because at the end of this, they were going to have to play one of the new songs. and they'd better get the audience in a good mood beforehand, because they weren't gonna be afterwards. I know I have a vague and inconsistent definition for what qualifies for this show, but I always wanted Trainwreckers to represent the end of something in an artist's career. Not the end of their hit-making years, then the end of their glory era, the end of their relevance. A lot of people will tell you that Metallica has never had an album like that. They've had peaks and valleys, sure, but never a career ender. After all, Metallica are still huge for a metal band. They're one of the top touring acts around, their albums still sell, and their follow-up, Death Magnetic, washed the taste of Saint Anger right out of everyone's mouth. Like, that was a real comeback, right? Was it? Let this be entirely clear. Before Saint Anger, Metallica was not big for a metal band. They were big. I heard Enter Sandman playing at Walmart. I remember seeing them get repeatedly voted onto Total Request Live. Yeah, you'd see Lars Ulrich on TRL next to Britney Spears and Eminem and Korn and the Backstreet Boys. They were that level of popular before Saint Anger. Whereas I haven't heard a single thing they released afterwards in the wild. So even though they tried to frame it as a comeback, no, I don't buy it. For the vast majority of listeners, myself included, Saint Anger forever put Metallica into the past tense. My only experience with Saint Anger is that I watched Some Kind of Monster way back in college, well after the fact, and if I had any opinion on what little music I heard in it through my dinky laptop speakers, I don't remember it. The documentary tells you a lot about Metallica as people, but not really that much about them as musicians or the album or what it is. That is something I'm going to find out for myself right now. So here we go. Here's my first listen of Saint Anger. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that sound?
My lifestyle determines my dance style. My lifestyle determines my dance style.
Really proud of that line, huh? Okay, what the fuck is that sound?
My lifestyle determines my dance style.
Okay, my first impression is that the production is just really tinny and dry, and lead singer James Hetfield is doing some kind of weird scream I don't recognize at all, and judging by the sound of it, drummer Lars Ulrich has replaced his snare drum with an oil barrel for some reason. Is it gonna sound like that the entire album? Oh boy. I don't want to belabor the point about the drums because it's always the first thing anyone mentions about Saint Anger. I will say that the drums are not actually the worst thing about it, but it's definitely the most confusing. Like, it's obviously not a good idea, and it would be just so easy to not do. Just someone, anyone, say, hey Lars, instead of a bunch of upturned paint cans, why don't you use actual drums? Like, more recently, just for fun, people have started dubbing Saint Anger's detuned snare into all of Metallica's classic tracks. Even 18 years later, it's still meme status terrible. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the snare is to Saint Anger what Jar Jar is to the Phantom Menace. Like, it's obviously terrible just in concept, and everybody hates it, arguably over-hates it, so that now hating it is a tedious cliche. Because it's not like removing it would magically make the project good. But it's always there, always making things worse, and whenever you think it might actually start being decent, there it is, ruining the moment. But hey, so what, the production sucks. That's not new to Metallica. 1988's And Justice for All is one of the most beloved metal albums of all time, even though it famously sounds like total butt. And all the fans said that their comeback album, Death Magnetic, sounded better on Guitar Hero than it did on the actual CD. If the songs are there, then the fans will put up with some iffy mixing choices. And they did not put up with this. The Metallica story, especially during this period, has been so firmly etched into rock and roll myth that I almost don't want to get into it. But I realize that not everyone was living and breathing Metallica in the early 2000s, so here's a quick rundown of where they were. After being the kings of the thrash underground in the 80s, they aimed for mainstream success in the 90s, prompting accusations of selling out, but becoming one of the biggest bands around. However, around the turn of Y2K, they hit a low point. Lars Ulrich declares war on MP3s, one of the most unpopular moves a rock star has ever made. And if you need to know why, enjoy this sketch from the 2000 VMAs.
We're not stealing, okay? We're just sharing with each other, you know?
So it's like if I take this soda can right here, I'm starting to like this whole sharing thing. Hey, boys! Napster. Sharing's only fun when it's not your stuff.
How could Lars have lost that PR war? The bad press gets worse when bass player Jason Newsted, fed up with being treated like dirt for the past 15 years, abruptly quits the band. Metallica attempts to put out the chaos by making a new record, but that also seems to fail when James Hetfield disappears into rehab and doesn't come back for nearly a year, leaving the band in limbo and on the verge of collapse. When he does return, the band clashes some more when Hetfield feels like the band isn't respecting his new sober lifestyle and schedule, especially Lars, who brought in a giant beer keg to play drums on. So with all that in the backstory, it's not surprising that they made the most abrasive and difficult album of their career. But that's what they intended. And in the movie, you can tell they're hyped for it. You can see their manager being really excited about the new direction of Metallica. So why isn't it good? Well, as you see in the documentary, most of the music was written after James exited rehab. So a lot of it is him grappling with his addictions and especially his anger problems, hence the name of the album. In fact, let's listen to the title track and lead-off single, Saint Anger.
Saint anger round my neck. Saint anger round my neck.
Saint Anger Around My Neck is a reference to the St. Christopher medallions people wear. I guess the idea was that instead of Christopher, the patron saint of protection, James is imagining like a patron saint of anger. You could call him Saint Anger.
You flush it out! You flush it out! Never gets respect! You flush it out!
It doesn't get respect because it's a dumb idea. Like the saint of anger, like it's an idea that never comes back. It doesn't get fleshed out. It never comes together in the song.
You flush it out! You flush it out!
What are you flushing out? The anger, the respect, none of this adds up to anything.
Madly in anger with you!
I think it'll serve us here to pull back and take a look at James Hetfield, who by this point in Metallica's history had become the stern, unpleasable dad of heavy metal. He likes hunting, football, cars, and country music. I've read up on the intra-band conflicts, and all the other members sound like rebellious kids acting out against him. Even Lars, who's a co-leader of the band. Him and Kirk would act all gay and shit because they knew it would piss him off. Newsted quit because he couldn't take Hetfield's control freak nature. It's all just a very you can't tell me what to do dad feel from all this. And, you know, I think we all have that moment when we realize our parents aren't gods. Like you saw one of them cry or something like that and you realize they're just people. And it's just a very unsettling and destabilizing feeling. On Saint Anger, I have never been more acutely aware of James Hetfield as a human being, and I hate it. This is James Hetfield, the gnarly, battle-scarred heavy metal badass. James blew up for you. He ignited into a fire inferno for you people. He has feelings now? In fact, it was just shocking me to watch the movie and see him put on a pair of grandpa glasses that make him look less like the guy from Metallica and more like a guy who writes about Metallica in some nerdy webzine. He's always just been this unstoppable, screaming beast man to me. Yeah, I know, it's not like he's never written personal lyrics before. Like, nothing else matters as a fucking love song to his wife. But I don't know, I just never thought about him that way. This album forces you to think about it.
Die a little more!
Not only with the lyrics, but also his singing is just really high up in the mix with no reverb or layering, so it's like he's right there shouting in your ear. And also he pushes himself way out of his range.
You went into another voice there, dude.
Yeah, you sure did. Look, I don't mean to insult a man who was at that period working very hard to purge himself of his most toxic instincts and trying to really work through some hard issues. But does it work as music? I've talked a lot about the negative reaction to this album, but I feel like I also have to acknowledge the substantial fandom for Saint Anger, or Stanger, as they call it. I don't know. Like, it is not even remotely hard to find Saint Anger apologists. On Metallica's forum on Reddit, there's an actual tag for the weekly Saint Anger defense thread. And I do get it, because it's supposed to be difficult to listen to, right? This isn't a Celine Dion record, it's metal. A lot of fans were upset when Metallica went mainstream, so to them, Saint Anger is a return to form.
And all in all, the album sounded deliberately unsophisticated. This divided the fan base. Some people admired the fact that it was a deliberate hark back.
And I can see it at least. On paper, it's really easy to defend. Just hearing how they conceptualize it, it sounds like Metallica was trying to make their In Utero. Just this raw, abrasive, uncommercial, uncompromising scream of pain from a struggling addict. Okay, well, James Hetfield is not Kurt Cobain. He's a man of many talents, but the voice of a generation he is not.
You live it or lie it, you live it or lie it.
Live it or lie, what?
Protector, rejector, infector.
James has never been this masterful lyricist or anything. A lot of the time he's ham-fisted and clunky. It has always bothered me that the best song from their best album has the worst ever rhyme of reason with season, a rhyme that usually sucks to begin with. But more importantly, James writes songs about death and war. He's not prepared to write songs about his inner child, at least not while still sounding like James Hetfield. I'm a lonely little boy and I need to be loved. Dad was real mean and now I need a hug. Whatever James's issues as a lyricist, it's never been a problem before. The second verse of Enter Sandman, their biggest hit, is awful, but no one cares. Well, in that case, no one even noticed because he's incomprehensible. But most of the time, the band rocks hard enough that he gets a pass. And the music does not give the lyrics any help here. I'm not gonna go through this album song by song because I literally cannot tell any of them apart. They all seem to chug at the same tempo, and then they'll thrash and bash double time, yet somehow it always seems like the same speed. There are no hooks, there are no memorable riffs. All of this sounds just...
I think it's fucking stock. Which part of that is unclear to you? I think it sounds stock to my ears.
Exactly. In fact, Lars's shitty drums make sense if you realize that even though it's a bad idea, it's still an idea. Like, why not make the drums sound like a trash can? It'll be edgy and hardcore, and you can play along at home. Look everyone, I'm Lars Ulrich! It's an idea that makes about as much sense as replacing the percussion with squeaky dog toys. But when you have no other ideas, you will cling to the one bad idea you have like a life raft. They've got nothing else. Like, one shocking thing about the album is that there are 0 guitar solos on here, because I guess they were not in style anymore with the kids these days. In the movie, you can see Kirk Hammett, whose literal only job is to provide guitar solos, really objecting to this.
The idea of the guitar solo as we have known it, maybe being something that was a little outdated.
If you don't play a guitar solo in one of these songs, that dates it to this period. I think that's stupid, and I think it's totally trendy.
Okay, well, there are 2 points here. Without Kirk's solos, yes, something definitely feels missing. But as for Kirk's charge that they're gonna sound like they're trend chasing, no, I don't really think that's true. I guess some parts in the album do sound a little like the newer metal bands of the day, but not really. Most new metal bands didn't sound like this. Nothing sounds like this. The lack of solos is really crushing because the songs are so long and the album is so long.
Some kind of monster!
Like, here's Some Kind of Monster, the song that named the movie. And it sure is some kind of monster. Some bloated, fat, stupid monster plodding across the landscape. It's 8 minutes long and it feels like 8 days. Like, yeah, their classic songs like Master of Puppets were long too, but Master of Puppets had parts. Identifiable parts. It had a new hook every couple minutes. This song has 0 hooks, so there's 0 reason for it to be this long. There's zero reason for the album to be this long. 75 minutes? You couldn't make any cuts? Purify had to be heard? This is widely considered the worst song in the album, which is to say the worst song they ever made. It is quite bad, and Hetfield is really phoning it in, but it's only barely worse than anything else on here. Meanwhile, one of the more liked album cuts appears to be something called Sweet Amber.
Wash your back so you don't stab mine. Get in bed with your own kind.
I might like that song more if I hadn't seen the movie where they show you that it was inspired by Metallica's resentment about having to record radio promos to get airplay.
Just to make them happy?
Yes, that's exactly what they're doing, and...
I understand the wash your back, wash mine thing. You know, I'll wash your back so you don't stab mine. That's insanity. We're gonna hurt you because we didn't get something.
Shoot the promos, you spoiled babies!
This squeezes tighter.
I'm sorry, nothing kills a song for me quicker than knowing it's about industry bullshit. On the other hand, even though the ask is so small, I do get that it's frustrating to work so hard to be this big and still not get to call your own shots. Maybe they should be angry, especially considering that radio didn't play the album anyway. Producer Bob Rock sniffed at radio like, oh, they only want Creed and Nickelback right now. Yes, the radio sucks, it always has. But this is an angry, aggressive metal album about struggling with one's emotions at a time when Stained and Trapped and 3 Days Grace were scoring big hits. This should have been a slam dunk. It could have easily been a big radio smash, and it wasn't because it was intentionally designed not to. You can't make the most unmusical album of your career and then be all aggrieved that it's not getting played next to Hoobastank. By the way, it is so weird that this is by Bob Rock. Like, Bob Rock is not just the producer on this album, he subs in as the bass player. This is the guy who turned Metallica into mainstream superstars. He's a guy who knows how to make anything sound good. Even when he works with shitty bands, he turns them into amazing sounding shitty bands. Where did he fail here? Like, Bob blames the drums on Lars, who thought they sounded great. But Bob Rock is well known as a guy who is not afraid to tell bands their work is shit and come back with something better.
Cut to the chase and fucking play, okay?
All right, man.
Now that you've, warmed up.
So why didn't he say something here? Like, even if he was on board with the whole unpolished garage band idea, he should have been able to step back at some point and say, okay, this experiment is not working. Well, I found a quote that said he approached the album not as Metallica's producer, but as their friend. And that makes the whole album make sense. Saint Anger is not a good album because the focus wasn't to make a good album. It was to keep the band together long enough to make an album. James's lyrics are first draft, and the drums are shit, and the riffs are shit, and the mixing is shit because it just needed to get done. So with that said, why don't we just skip to the end? This is the album closer, All Within My Hands. How long is this? 8 minutes, huh? You know what, why don't we just skip this too? I swear to God, I gave this album a fair shake. But this is a record that is exactly as bad as its reputation suggests. And to everyone who likes it for its raw emotion, I'll admit that it makes it unique, but it doesn't make it rise above the level of a curiosity. It is an artless, ugly, and creatively exhausted album, and the only thing you can really say for it is that it kept the band together. They were going through therapy, and Saint Anger seems like it was also a therapy session. And like most therapy sessions, it should have stayed private, but it was cathartic and it was necessary. Saint Anger, for all its faults, kept them together long enough to survive, to keep kicking ass on tour, and performing and recording new music afterwards that, even if it isn't exactly as good as the classics, it's at least good enough to keep them from being total embarrassments. Except for Lulu. But that is a story for another day. Peace.
My lifestyle turns my death star, my lifestyle.